Hey, what we got, friends? This is Ernie Yarbrough.
Hannah Stevens.
And we are here today, part 2 of a 4-part series on Own Your Health. You know, last time we started off with the idea of the power of a story. And so obviously in this new season where we've kind of gone in a different direction in terms of new series, new voices, we thought it would be really useful and profitable to come up with this idea of taking ownership of your health. Because, you know, at the root of it, that's where all really positive change begins, is the fact that we have to embrace the fact that we're responsible for things in our lives that we, other people, other decisions, places certainly impact us. And we could all tell stories of how we've been impacted or blessed by other people's decisions or influence. But there comes a point in our lives where we have to sit down and realize that whatever hardship we're facing, that by the mercy of God, we have to not only acknowledge that He's in control, but we also have to acknowledge that we're responsible.
Yeah.
And owning your health in terms of obviously 2020, what has been brought to the fore with just the power that medical and health entities have, really that we give them to have in our lives, has really brought forward the question in a lot of people's minds of ownership and responsibility. And so we wanted to kind of start off in part 1 with the idea of the power of a story, of just sharing our stories of health and journeying, kind of what we've gone through personally, individually, because that's where you kind of have to start, right? Whenever you deal with a situation or something that maybe there's a need, you have to take a moment to take stock of where you've been. Exactly. And hear the story, right? And so, as we mentioned, even in the Bible, the Lord did that often with telling parables. And parables are they're powerful things because they let you get into somebody else's story. And at the end of it, you realize that maybe part of it's your story too, right? And so, that was kind of part 1, just, hey, by our story, ask yourself to sit down and tell what your story is, right? And see what your story is of your health journey, to see where you're at, so that you can take stock and make positive decisions moving forward. And so in this episode, part 2 of Own Your Health, I want to talk to this idea, even at the very title of the podcast, of Own Your Health, of ownership and identifying what's yours. And so I wanted to kind of lay out 3 key concepts that I want to explore a little bit in conversation here, and that is ownership, as I mentioned, identifying what's yours, and then the idea of stewardship. Because I think those three concepts are really important in terms of identifying what it is that is ours, right? And then ultimately why we, as people of faith, even operate the way that we do, on the idea of stewardship and the idea of taking responsibility for things that we ultimately surrender back to the God who made us, right? And so on this idea of ownership, you know, Hannah, when you think of ownership, what kind of comes to your mind? Just the concept of ownership.
I guess taking personal responsibility, I think for me, a very worldly example would be, owning a car, owning a house, owning something that you can proudly call yours. But in my mind, when I think of ownership, it's me taking ownership, me taking responsibility personally to do better. So whether that's taking ownership of my health and what I'm putting in and on my body, or whether that's taking ownership in how I think, and allowing myself to meditate on truth rather than lies, or whatever it may be, to me, ownership is simply, in my mind, personal responsibility.
I looked it up in the dictionary, and it gave the definition, the exclusive right of possession, legal or just claim to a title. As a parent, I laugh. I see this in kids. My father-in-law, as you know, the kids refer to him as Papaw. He said, when you look at little kids, nobody has to teach a little child to, if another little child comes along and takes one of their toys, like, you don't have to teach that child whose toy has been taken to crawl over there and say, give me that and take it back. They just do it naturally because they, we have to teach them to share as well. But they have this innate understanding that this has been given to me, and this is mine. And while they wouldn't say I'm responsible for it, they might have more of a concept of it's mine to use as I want to use it.
Exactly.
And don't come over here taking my stuff, without asking me. And of course it's hard to ask in baby language. You just take it and you take it and we don't run with it, you crawl with it.
Yeah.
But so the idea of ownership is exclusive right of possession, legal or just claim, a legal and rightful title to something. And I think really because of that, ownership really starts with a state of understanding in your mindset. Like, what is it that I have a just and legal right and title to? You know, and we'll give you some helpful points in the concept of when we get into identifying what's yours. But the idea of ownership is to own or to have ownership in ownership by right and ownership by example is kind of how I think of it. So the ownership by right is, you know, hey, you bought a car. Well, the title has your name on it, right? You bought property, a house. It has you have a legal right, you know, in a court of standing that would be yours, right? You have ownership by right, but then you also have ownership by example, right? I think I saw it. Meyer laughs about one of the ways I dealt with COVID, and Hannah knows because all these packages keep coming in the mail. That I dealt with COVID was by buying T-shirts and rings too. You know, and I saw this really cool shirt. It said something like, I didn't buy it. I wanted to, but I didn't. That, you know, your title gives you claim, you know, to be king, but men don't follow titles. You know, and so it's important to have a legal claim to something, a just, you know, claim, a title or whatever. But it's also important to have ownership by example. And I don't know, maybe you talked to that about, you probably saw that for sure, even in your rowing, your experience by example as an athlete. So maybe talk to, how have you seen people who have done ownership by example?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I guess the best example I can technically think of right now would be Nick Saban. I mean, you look at him.
Nobody questions that he's the boss.
Exactly. He's the GOAT, right?
He knows that, and they know that, but his example.
Yes, his example and his ability to take ownership. And, I mean, one of the biggest things people don't know about Nick Saban is that he is a personal recruiter. So you have a lot of college football programs that they won't send the head coach to recruit players. They'll send assistant coaches. They'll send maybe even practice squad coaches to go to these guys and say, hey, Coach wants you to come visit. Well, to some athletes, that's still an honor. But Nick Saban changed the game, and Nick Saban's like, no. We're going to take my plane that Alabama has, and we are going to fly to these cities that people don't even know about, and we're going to go to podunk towns, and I'm going to meet these players face to face and make them realize that they are important. And so Nick Saban took ownership in the personal connection to players and the ability to recruit, that it affected every single program. So these programs that were kind of getting by not sending their head coach were suffering because they weren't taking ownership. They weren't taking so-called personal responsibility to go there. They were relying on other people. So Nick Saban is an easy example when you come to that. There's a reason why he has a contract as student. Everyone's mad about it. It's because he has made the University of Alabama football program his. He has taken ownership, not in a arrogant way, but in a taking humble pride in it and wanting it to be the best it can be. And so you look at someone like me who's a rower, and we go to CrossFit. There are several people who know that I was a collegiate rower, so they know Hannah has experience, Hannah has knowledge. Let me get some pointers from her on how to do X, Y, and Z. So having ownership and having experience gives you the ability to be a leader, a natural born leader in that, because especially if you're good at it. I mean, I'm not going to go up to someone who weighs 350 pounds. That always bothered me in elementary school. I had a really overweight PE coach who would tell us to run. And one day I looked at him. I'm not going to say his name in case he's listening. He was just being really mean. I'm like, why don't you actually run with us today, coach? He looked at me, and I think I had to run an extra mile. But I did not respect him. Yeah. And he clearly did not take ownership in his health. He did not.
That's right.
But to me, just those examples is when you are good at something, and when you're a hard worker and you're humble and you put in the work and you take ownership in a healthy and humble way, people are going to naturally look up to you. I mean, it's like when people are RCDs, right, in Young Living. Yeah. I mean, and you've done the business, you've worked your way up, and people naturally want you to speak. They want you to help lead their teams because you have that ownership. Yeah. You have that ability.
People want to see people who made it help them make it. Yeah. But also, obviously with the example of Nick Saban, that's something that he could like any assistant coach or whoever athletic person in the athletic department would be super honored.
Exactly.
To him, he understands that the next generation of football players is the lifeblood of the program. Yeah. And so he's not going to delegate that. He's going to lead by example in the fact that he's going to take ownership, not just by right or by title.
Exactly.
Right, but by his example. There are certain things that that he's not going to delegate. He's going to do them himself. And when you own something, there are legitimate ways in which delegation. I mean, you can't be all things to all people, right? Nick Saban's not the strength coach.
Yeah, you can't go everywhere by himself.
He can't go everywhere, right? But the point being is that they're part of this idea of ownership is not just saying, okay, by legal right and title, this is mine, but what are the areas that I need to express different types of leadership in, and some of them are so important that I've got to be present in those.
Exactly.
And that brings us, after this idea of ownership means to have a just claim or title, and also even by example, whether you delegate or not, gets us into this second area that I wanted to talk about, which was identifying what is yours. And so kind of three areas that I had mentioned, wrote down here for thought and discussion, was identifying what's yours by right, by delegation, and by implementation. And we've talked about that, kind of what's yours by right, your positional ownership. The parents, right, they positionally have authority and right to lead their children, but obviously it's important there that, and as our children get older, we delegate certain things, right? Hey, help us with the trash, help us with this, functional things that the home needs. But then there's also things, and grandparents help and reinforce structure and discipline and right and wrong and good decisions versus bad decisions. But nobody can be the parent, right? And so it is, even when we fail at that as parents, we have to understand that God has given us the responsibility to guide and steer the ship, and not pass it off to somebody else just because we don't want to do something. And where we fail at that, we have to recognize that and change. And I think one of the ways that's helpful for me to figure out, okay, what's mine by right versus delegation versus implementation. My dad has this thing. Have you ever heard my dad talk about circles of influence? I don't know if you have or haven't. Yes. And so the idea is, right, vaguely. So we have this huge pond out by our house, and so you throw a rock in the pond, right, and it creates rings of circles, concentric circles. And so the idea there is that if you think about each of your circles of influence as those circles, and so the bigger circles represent where it's further away from you and more people are involved, so like on a national level, right? And then the next circle is a little bit closer to you, less people, right? And that may be on the state level, right? And then the next circle, which is less people and it's closer to you in the center, maybe it's your community, and then the next circle closer to you is maybe your church, right? And then maybe your family, and then you, right? And so the idea of circles of influence is that the further out you go, the more people you contact, but your influence goes down, right? And the closer in you come toward the center, the less people you contact, but your influence goes up.
Exactly.
And so I think that's a really helpful idea in terms of, okay, where do I think about my focus of, I have to identify what's mine by right, but how do I know when to delegate versus implement myself? And the answer, I think, in the idea of circles of influence is the closer you get to the center of the circle, which is you, delegation goes away and implementation, or goes down, implementation of yourself goes up. And so you think about things even from the closest circle of even your family into you, and that's whether that's parenting, discipleship, training, obviously things that regard your body like personal health. And that's where, to me, that's a helpful barometer for, I've got to, right now there's so many voices about experts and trust the expert or trust the whatever.
Trust the science.
Right, trust the science, right? In terms of your health, when the reality is that, perfect example, we had a friend of ours who wrote an article defending the idea that because your health is so vital to who you are as a person and local, as it were, to you, because it's in your body, that you should be taking responsibility for that. You should be the first point of attack, as it were, for research, asking questions, and all those things. And the Rolling Stones picked up her article, or I think it was maybe, I don't know if it was an article or a Facebook post, or
it was an article,
made fun of her. And her Young Living business exploded the next month. Because like, oh, that's stupid. You should trust the expert. And again, it's not saying that people who specialize in things aren't useful. Of course they are.
Yes.
I mean, it's great to have a contractor or to have somebody who knows how to pour concrete or lay sheetrock or all those things, whatever, right? But ultimately, you're still responsible to make sure that those things, if you don't have the skill set for something, you're still responsible in some of those arenas to make sure that the job gets done right. And so what we're saying about this idea of owning your health is that where maybe you don't feel like you have the expertise or the skill set yet, you can.
Yeah, and I also say, I think, I read that article and I laughed because I think Rolling Stones, they kind of dug themselves a grave, because that is an exact example of what it means to take personal responsibility. And I think it shows the lack thereof, the lack of knowledge and expertise. And people don't. I mean, it's very common. People in Young Living World, we get called crunchy all the time. I tell Myra, your wife, all the time that they might as well say we're so crunchy, we're like stale granola, right? That's my saying.
Yeah.
And I think what it comes down to is that people think we're weird or we're out of the norm because we do take personal responsibility in our health. We don't go with the norms. We don't smoke. We don't drink. We don't do all these things that other people would. Not that that's bad, but
eat tons of fast food.
Yes, and
in other words, take all the
chemicals,
convenient
exactly.
paths,
but that's what we're programmed like that. In America, people are programmed to think that's okay, that's normal. And when you question the norm, when you question what has been programmed, so to say, people are going to they're going to respond the way that the Rolling Stones did and make that individual, who we never talk about, feel dumb, when in retrospect, it, like you said, it brought more, what do we say, ownership. She had more of an example, and people respected that. And they're like, you know what, we understand where she's coming from, we respect that.
And people realize that there are certain things that it's okay to delegate, like sheetrock.
Exactly.
Right? But there are some things that are so important, like your health, that the idea of delegating that away and just trusting somebody else instead of you being your first line of defense, right? Which is why we have things like Jim Bob's awesome series with OYH Plus on body systems, right? Because you start with, okay, what are my, how am I made? What's the makeup of my body? How do they work? And because people realize that there are some things that are so important, they don't have an option to be ignorant on. And a lot of times people, who take and we've all been there and done that, the more convenience route of health, they just take what is given to them, or what say, just do this, or just do that, or just do this, or trust us and do this. Oftentimes, again, we've been there because we've all experienced this. The people who so often give those messages to people never seek to empower them with knowledge. Never seek to empower them with, hey, we want to create less dependency, so we want to empower you to be able to own this and make decisions and understand. And so when that process is not taken, people end up either being continually just receiving whatever they're told, or they're forced to go another route to get education for themselves, which is why alternative areas of health, wellness, education have so blossomed, because people realize they're not getting the tools that they need in a lot of times conventional places and methods to take ownership and to have knowledge of what actually works and to understand how they're made. And that's where I think that, again, it's important in this idea of ownership to know what's yours by right. So that gives you the whole picture to know, okay, of those things that have been given to me by my right, by being made in the image of God, I can choose from those things what I'm going to delegate, and I can choose from those things what I'm going to implement myself. And when you find places that don't want to give you tools to be able to implement things yourself, and so often in that discussion of freedom of choice and so forth, you find ironically that people don't want to give you the freedom of choice. They don't want to give you the knowledge and the tools and the resources that you need to be able to make those decisions. So we have to know what ownership is, right? Living present in the moment of what is yours by right and by what is yours by example, right? Identifying what's yours also by delegation or implementation, once you see the full scope of what's been given to you as a creature made in the image of God. And this idea of circles of influence helps narrow down where should I focus taking implementation, right? Where should I focus on, okay, if I don't know, I need to know. Like, I mean, it's with Gary, Gary Young, right? I want to learn how to distill oils. I'm going to go to France. Hey, we need to get lavender back in America. I'm going to put some seeds in my boot. And whatever he did, he taught himself, right? And that's kind of, to me, one of the brilliant aspects of the American spirit is, whatever I don't know, I can learn. So don't talk to me as if I'm stupid or ignorant or whatever. I can learn it, And if and I'm going to be able to decide, okay, you're not wanting to share. This person over here wants to share and teach me. That's where I'm going to go. I never forgot my first day of physics at local community college. And the professor said there, he was an awesome professor, and he said, a lot of physics professors have this idea about physics, that they have this huge pot of gold, and they're going to throw you a couple of coins, and then they're going to hide the rest of it and just, see if you can go find it and dig it out. He said, well, I'm here today to give you the whole pot of gold. And that's kind of what our mission here is at OYH, is to take whatever knowledge and resources we have learned and to share them with you so that you can quickly get up and running and get down the right path of implementing and owning your own health.
Can I give a quick story?
Oh yeah, sure, go ahead. Yep, fire away.
One of the things that you said a minute ago about education, and my cousin shared this story on Facebook a few days ago. My younger cousin Brett, they live in Washington State, and Brett was enrolled in one of probably the best schools in the state of Washington. I think if you looked at the education system in the school he went to, it would by far be amazing. I think it was honestly just as much as sometimes going to a college, how much they paid per year for him to go. And it was a school that offered a lot and blah, blah, blah. Well, COVID happened. And they were put in a position where they could send him to school with a bunch of guidelines and restrictions they didn't agree with, or they could choose to take ownership in his education. And they chose the latter. And not only did Brett and his family learned a lot about what it looked like to homeschool and to, educate themselves at home. But he blossomed so much so that he is going to Liberty University this fall for graphic design. And one of the things I'd encourage him with is like, dude, you need to post this on social media. You need to tag a bunch of people. Well, over time he did. And all of his graphics, he was doing a lot with the NBA, NFL, they were picking them up. And he was getting so much more exposure because he took ownership, and his education was getting school done at a great time in the morning, so he could put time into creating things and taking ownership in what he wanted to do in the future. And so that was just one example of many, I think, people who have been put in this position in the last year of, not that there's anything wrong with sending your kids to school, but a lot of people, even here we know, Ernie, that were put in a position where they didn't necessarily want to homeschool their kids, but once they got through it and they realized, wow, this actually... My kids are being more creative. My kids are getting to school at 11 a.m.
I'm getting a relationship with my kids.
Exactly. And so, that was just one story of many I wanted to share, just because,
That's a great
it was
example.
there was an unintentional. They were given that opportunity, so to speak.
Forced
they chose
on them,
yes,
as it were.
To take ownership and went. And some people took it, some people didn't. But for my family, it was probably one of the best decisions they ever made, and I think it's actually impacted her next two younger kids under her to realize, wow, Brett has blossomed so much more than he would have in school because he didn't have the time to do what he wanted to do. You're going to school from 7:30 to 3:30 every day. Yeah. By the time he gets home, his brain's done. So if he's done with school at 11 o'clock, he has 3 or 4 hours where he can put into, anyway, all that to say.
This stuff. And,
exactly.
and that's an example where the education of our children is so important. That's one of those ones that I would lean heavily much more towards implementing myself or having very careful oversight of it, because that, again, circles of influence. You get closer to your family, delegation goes down, implementation goes up. I want to wrap this talk up today with just the idea quickly of stewardship. Ownership is important to know what is yours by right and by example. We need to be able to identify what's ours by right, by delegation, by implementation. But if ultimately that was our only focus and we forget, we take very unashamedly and seriously here at OYH that we love the Lord and we're people of faith. And so ultimately it's not just about what's mine, right? But it's that I'm a steward.
Exactly.
And the whole idea of stewardship is something has been entrusted to you to take care of. And we've been made in the image of God. God has given us bodies, souls, and spirits. And the Bible says that our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so while we understand that one day we're all going to die, as a friend of mine, he's in the chat forum, this one guy's tagline is, nobody gets out of this alive, right? But our bodies will return to dust until one day when the Lord returns and we get new bodies and a new heaven and a new earth. But And we look, the older we get and the slower we get, the more we look forward to that.
Yep.
But the idea of stewardship is that ultimately what I'm doing is not just because it's mine,
Exactly.
but because it's an offering of praise back to God who made us. And whenever that is a really key component of anything that we do, because usually from a human relationship, right, when we know that somebody's going to check up on us, we do a better job. But as believers, what we do when we do it from a spirit of praise,
Exactly.
then it's not just that we know we're going to that we're giving accountability for it, but the best way to do something the best is to do it with a spirit of praise, because then your heart and your mind is totally engaged in what you're doing. And so I want to just encourage each of you as you embrace this idea of owning your health, that it's every bit as much a spiritual activity as it is mental and physical, and that you are literally doing something that is pleasing to the God who made you, and is an offering of sacrifice and praise to Him when you take ownership of what He has given you, because He intends for you, when you do that, like Adam and Eve in the garden, right? God said, here's the garden, tend it, take care of it, right? Make it a beautiful place where the glory of God is shown, and our bodies are the same for that. Yeah. So I hope you've enjoyed podcast number 2, Own Your Health. Coming up, we're going to be looking into actually breaking apart the human body, soul, and spirit, and looking into practical implementations and ways of how you actually own tools and resources, right? We've talked about the stories. We've talked about the ideal of ownership. And now coming up, it's going to be time to start cracking open the practical toolbox and getting tools out and seeing how to use them. So for Oily App, I am Ernie Yarrow.
I'm Hannah Stevens.
Encouraging you to steward and own your health one day, one decision, one oil drop at a time.